to introduce our plenary speaker this afternoon, Professor Naiomi Metallic. Naiomi is Mi'kmaq from the Listigouche Mi'kmaq First Nation in Quebec. She's both a practicing lawyer and an academic, specializing in Aboriginal law, Indigenous law, human rights law, and other areas. She's worked with a firm in Halifax for 20 years, including her work as a summer and articling student while studying law at the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University. And from 2006 to 2007, she was a clerk at the Supreme Court of Canada, working under Justice Michelle Bastarache. This is perhaps the most prestigious honor for a law school graduate. After 10 years of practice as a lawyer, Naiomi made the move to academia. Receiving a graduate degree from Osgoode School of Law in Toronto, she's currently Associate Professor of Law and the Chancellor's Chair in Aboriginal Law and Policy at Dalhousie University. And importantly, she continues on her path of meshing practice and theory, a path that continues to inform her commitment to improving the lives of Indigenous communities and peoples. Naiomi has numerous publications, including academic articles and reports, but of interest to us here at this conference is her interest in language and in Mi'kmaq, language learning, and which she's going to show us in her talk, what she'll talk about in her talk today. Naiomi comes from a family of linguists. Her late father, Emmanuel Metallic, authored the Metallic Mi'kmaq English Reference Dictionary. Her sister, Jessica Metallic, is a Mi'kmaq language teacher, and Naiomi has been working with her, learning the language since 2018, which she'll probably talk about. But Naiomi Metallic is truly a language warrior, a distinguished word warrior, and I would add a legal and academic warrior, which we are truly privileged to have her speak with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. See if this works. I don't know if I have to hold it up here. Is it on? Here. It's oh, that's not good. Okay. I also don't want to hold it like Bob Barker, and the price of the waterbed is. Okay. Okay, there we go. That's perfect. I'm just gonna flip it here. I'm not a walker when I move around anyway. So there we go. Okay. First of all, Gwe, Eldasi Begisin Kisko, Deluisi Naiomi Walkwan, Bleomi Listigoch, Garawigi Ekchibukto, Deluisi Benachnucha, E. Naruwes Metallic, Negam na Dlisudriech, Aka Gusuahanich. Introducing myself in Mi'kmaq, and I also, want to thank the Algonquins for their care of this territory, and for the young man who said the wonderful acknowledgement today and the story about your grandmother. Just really appreciate that. And also thank you to the organizers. They saw me last year. They said, come again this year and come and give this talk. So there it is. So today I'm going to talk to you about some work that I've started doing in the last few years around Indigenous language and law revitalization, primarily law revitalization, but my work in Indigenous languages has really taken off with that. But let me tell you a little bit about myself some more to kind of contextualize this story. So as was mentioned, my dad was a Mi'kmaq linguist, but growing up, my mom is French, she's from Quebec, and when they met, like, she didn't speak English, he didn't speak French, but English became the sort of the language of the household. And of that time also, many other families in the community were not teaching people in my generation, and there wasn't a school in the community at that time. We were bused across the river to Campbellton, New Brunswick for school. So although I heard my father speaking to his mother and his brother and other people from the community who would come, language transmission didn't really happen at that point in time for me, nor for my sisters. But one of my sisters, Jessica, decided that she was going to pursue working in the language like my dad, and is now a completely fluent speaker, teaches at the immersion program for adults in the community, and essentially, as the story goes on, she became my language teacher as well in the last few years. So as was mentioned, I had a great practice in Aboriginal law, so Canadian law as it relates to Aboriginal or Indigenous peoples, and there's a distinction with Indigenous law, which is the laws of Indigenous peoples, and we'll talk about that definition more after. And I enjoyed my practice a lot, but I did feel at certain points that I was missing out on something, that there was sort of a gap. So always interfacing with Canadian law, and even though most of my clients were Indigenous, just still felt that there was sometimes something missing. And then, so anyway, I pursued academia in 2016. And one of the first things that people said to me, and my new colleagues at the law school, was, when are you going to start teaching an Indigenous law course? And I was daunted because I had, I went to the same law school, but at that time there was like one Aboriginal law course. Indigenous law is something that's really taken off, I'd say, in the last 10 years. And I'll speak more about that, but I was a little bit myself sort of like, I don't know. I don't know the first thing about it. I've taught Aboriginal or practiced Aboriginal law for the past decade. But I said, well, you can do this. So I gave myself 3 years. I said, in 3 years, you're going to teach an Indigenous law course. And I said, as you do that, you need to learn your language. You need to take courses. There's got to be a connection between them. And I'll talk more about that connection between them as I go along here. Make sure I keep myself on my timer. And so it did come to pass that I have been teaching a course about 3 years after I said I would, or when I first started. So I was on schedule for that, and also taking regular language classes with my sister as things went along. And I'm going to teach you about the things that I am teaching in my Indigenous law course. And it was really through, I'd say, some of the really generous generosity of people like Hadley Friedland, Val Napoleon, John Burroughs, who are like leading scholars in this area, sharing with me their materials, especially Hadley Friedland, that has really helped me move along in my understanding. And as I've been doing that, been adding to it with the knowledge that I have been bringing from learning Mi'kmaq. And so I'm going to talk about a paper that I wrote based on learning the language and also learning these methodologies in Indigenous law revitalization. Just to talk a little bit about the image, that is called Glooskap's Gift, and that is a painting by my cousin, Jonathan LaBilwa. He's a really talented artist. And for those of you who may not be familiar with who Glooskap is, he is a major figure in Mi'kmaq mythology, as well as some of the other members of the Wabanaki Confederacy, like the Wolastoqey, the Passamaquoddy, and the Passamaquoddy. He features in all of our legends. And as I kind of go along, I'm going to tell you about work that we're doing with stories about Glooskap. We have many in Mi'kmaq. And some of the work we're doing to draw out legal principles from Glooskap stories, and also Mi'kmaq language associated with those stories, in order to help communities in Mi'kmaq revitalize their legal orders. So I'll get to that. You'll get the bigger picture of that as I go along. So let's move on. Let's sort of start. So you're gonna learn about a couple things. You're gonna learn about Indigenous law revitalization efforts in Canada, and a basic introduction to that, as well as some facts about Mi'kmaq and how Indigenous languages can be used to revitalize Indigenous law. So let's start with the TRC Commission report and talking about what is true reconciliation. So the report defines true reconciliation as establishing and maintaining mutually respectful relationships between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in this country. And one of the things that the Commission also said is that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples ought to be the framework for reconciliation in Canada. And also that another key ingredient of reconciliation is that Indigenous people must be able to recover, learn, and practice their own distinct legal traditions, and that establishing respectful relationships requires the revitalization of Indigenous laws. And the comment about the UN Declaration about being the framework, I mean, the UN Declaration is also very much aligned with this idea of Indigenous peoples exercising control of their lands and their livelihood. And there are specific provisions about self-determination, self-government, and also the use of their juridical customs, Indigenous peoples' juridical customs. And we seem to be at a really interesting point right now where there's a lot more recognition of this issue. So some of you might be aware that in February, our Supreme Court of Canada decided a very important case on Indigenous issues related to a federal act around Indigenous child welfare. And the act was sort of a very novel. There had been an act in the US similar to this since the 1970s, but in Canada, it was the first of its sort to try to address systemic inequities in child welfare across Canada when it relates to Indigenous peoples, but also recognize the inherent right to self-government with respect to child and family services. And the government of Canada, when it passed it in 2019, talked about how this was implementing the UN Declaration. And the Supreme Court picked up on that, and you may also know that Canada passed an act trying to implement the UN Declaration in Canada in 2021. And so the Supreme Court, to the surprise of many of us, also, spoke about UNDRIP a lot. I was actually blown away. In fact, so they recognize and they cite UNDRIP to say that, or the TRC to say that UNDRIP should be the framework for reconciliation in Canada. They speak about that and how the act was trying to do that. And they also talk about how UNDRIP is actually applicable in Canadian positive law due to the UNDRIPA Act that was passed. And so it must be engaged with and applied to interpret Canadian law. So that's really something. And then the other thing that the court picked up on, which was really something, is there's a book that was that came out a few years ago by various Indigenous scholars, Gordon Christie, John Burroughs, and many, many others were involved in it. And it's called Braiding Legal Orders. And picking up on this idea from the TRC, the Supreme Court said that, in fact, reconciliation in Canada involves the braiding of state, international, and Indigenous legal orders. And so that's a huge recognition from our court, which really heretofore had really not discussed Indigenous legal orders very much outside perhaps the proving of Section 35 Aboriginal rights. So this is a big recognition. But the other sort of introductory piece that I want to cover is, there's the things that are driving this at a sort of large normative level from the TRC and now the Supreme Court. But at a sort of practical level, I always feel this slide's really important to make this point. So why does this work matter? And I'm talking about why does it matter to Indigenous people? And there's a wonderful article by Hadley Friedland, and she has a couple actually that talk about, how the Canadian legal order has been disordering to Indigenous communities. It does not create order for Indigenous peoples. And in fact, those of you who may do some dabbling in law or lawyers yourself, you know that in law, we always talk about the reasonable person, the standard of the reasonable person. So Hadley takes this, this idea of the reasonable person, but she takes the reasonable Aboriginal person and says, like, if you were to ask them about their feelings about the Canadian legal order, they would not accept the legitimacy of the Canadian legal system because of how disordering it has been. It has not been a source of protection or safety. And so we need alternatives. I'm not saying complete separate legal systems, and I'm happy to answer more questions about, how UNDRIP and other things in Canada, like land claims, do create models for how the coexistence of legal orders can happen. I'm going to assume that for this talk, that those things are already kind of in play. But in terms of Indigenous legal orders, as Hadley says, if disorder, or with respect to the Canadian legal order, if disorder is the problem, then the solution is to seek a legitimate and effective source of order. And that legitimate and effective source of order can be found in Indigenous legal orders, and that there is much work to be done in order to provide, indeed, legitimate sources of norms for Indigenous communities in order to control their own destinies. So let's do a little bit of what is Indigenous Law 101. So I've spoken to it a little bit, but it is, so I've made a distinction already with Aboriginal law. So Aboriginal law is what we refer to as Canadian law about Indigenous peoples. So Gladue, the Indian Act, I would say it right now, Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution that recognizes Aboriginal and treaty rights. I would include that in that category. But then again, Indigenous law are the Indigenous peoples, the original people's own laws, their own legal orders. And, you know, when I teach my course that I have now, I mean, we spend a lot of time on different legal theories about what is law, looking at different theories of law. We're not going to spend all that too much time on it here, but I think one of the easiest or the best ways to sort of break it down, and even when I do work with communities, sometimes, you know, people say, well, I'm not a lawyer, what can I do in this? You know, in terms of the workshops that I hold, and I say, look, law is everyone's business, and everyone does law, really. When people live together, there is law, because law are the rules, the principles, and the values that guide our interactions with each other, right? So it's our concepts of justice, fairness, peace, and relationships, and it's how people resolve problems together, they make decisions together, and maintain group safety, coordinate resources and relationships, work towards societal goals, and define obligations and responsibilities. I will also say, and I'm happy to speak about this more later if when we have time for questions, but some of the theorists who are talking about Indigenous law, and for those who are new to this area, I would suggest probably the first book to start with, and this is what I assign in my class, is John Burroughs' Canada's Indigenous, oh my God, I'm forgetting the name of the book off the top of my head, but Canada's Indigenous Constitutions. In that book, you know, John really kind of took the lead in sort of explaining what can be encapsulated within this broad concept of Indigenous law. And I think something that's really important about it, he as an example, gives sort of 5 types of Indigenous law, including customary, but he says not all Indigenous law is just customary. It's more than that. It can be deliberative, meaning it's law that people discuss and reach consensus on through, you know, various different ways they might come together to decide decisions. It can be sacred law. It can also be based on things like creation stories. And the point being that, you know, it's a broad definition of what is Indigenous law. And there's also this idea that, you know, Indigenous law is not frozen in time. I'm not just speaking about sort of anthropological sort of studies of what like Indigenous people's customs were. The discussion that is happening in the field of law around Indigenous law is seeing it as something living and vital, something that needs to be revitalized because it has been impacted by colonialism. But that it is, we can look to things from the past, but also have discussions about, you know, what we draw out of our shared past history and what we want to use today to govern ourselves. So I can have a longer conversation about that, but do keep in mind, so sometimes when I've given this presentation, people are like, well, you know, is it just customs? And is it, you know, is it just, you know, things that you did 500 years ago? And it's no, Indigenous law has a broad definition, and it can include things that, you know, positive law that groups pass today, like Indian Act bylaws or laws that groups are passing through their inherent jurisdiction. So it can take a variety of different forms, and it isn't frozen in time. To explain some of the work that is happening in Indigenous law revitalization. So first, I guess I come back to the point that this revitalization work, you know, is happening because not in every case with every nation or every community, but there certainly has been a lot of damage to Indigenous legal orders. If you think about the damage that is done by colonialism to languages, Indigenous languages, you might even say that perhaps the damage is even greater, that, you know, to the extent that Indigenous people's legal orders have been dismissed, denied, overridden over, you know, 150 years plus. So that's not to say that there isn't law that does exist already and that communities are working with this law. But we are in need, our communities are in need of ways to look back to our resources of Indigenous law, which I'll speak to in a moment, and draw out, resources for our use in terms of revitalizing our legal orders. So to help in thinking about this, one of the best examples, or one of the writers who I really like to rely on, is Ghislain Otis's work. He's a Quebec scholar, but he works at Ottawa U, and he has worked with different Indigenous groups in different parts of the world. And looking at different legal orders, he says, really, when you look at legal orders, you can essentially boil them down to 5 aspects. This is consistent across any legal order. So you have values, principles, rules, actors, and processes. And those are all geared towards, again, the sort of idea of law as rules and principles and values to regulate and resolve interactions between groups and their environment. So an example, or how Otis breaks this down further, is he explains that a value is a quality or characteristic deemed by a given community to be important or good. So something you value, this is a value. And he says a principle is a step up from that. It is a reference standard, an ought statement based on that value and on which it is appropriate to regulate an action or conduct, a generative, normative translation of the ideal embodied by a value. And then another step up from a principle is a rule, right? So a specific prescription applied to a particular situation in order to give practical effect to a principle. And the example he gives us, the 3 actually being in coordination or discussion with each other. He gives the example of an Indigenous group in a subsistence economy. So he talks about how they may have the value of respect for life, which will in turn generate the principle of the sharing of food resources with other members of the community who may be in need, which may embody a rule that they may have to confer on a family or individual the right to come to their hunting territory so that they may be able to hunt and feed themselves. So we can see that they're related to each other. And in the work that I'm going to be describing to you, a lot of the resources of Indigenous law that I'm speaking of, and particularly language, can reveal values, can reveal principles. And those things can be harnessed by communities to then create frameworks, rules, prescriptive rules, or even any type of law, of positive law, or to determine decision-making within the community. It can be used for a variety of purposes. When we think about values, principles, and rules, those equally exist in the Canadian legal system too. Often non-lawyers think about law as prescriptive rules, thou shalt not do X, right? But there's a lot more going on. If you look at the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, for example, that's all sort of written at the level of principle, right? The right to equality. And there are many values embedded in the Canadian legal order. And one of the examples I will give sometimes is, sentencing principles. The Criminal Code of Canada sets out a variety of different sentencing values, really. When you read them from 718 of the Criminal Code of Canada, essentially a list of values that judges have to be mindful of when they're sentencing people. So these exist in every legal order. And now I'm going to talk about resources or sources of Indigenous law. So Indigenous peoples have legal resources, but they're not written down as you might, see them in the Canadian legal order or other European derived legal orders. So they're not written down in a statute. You wouldn't find them in a statute book, but they exist in other places. We have many different other resources. And so my slide has things like knowledge holders and elders, but there's far more than that as well. There are stories teach about how our values and principles and rules, as do our ceremonies, songs, dances, the land, our relationship with the land, place names. I'll talk more about those later. Various other sources that can be harnessed. And so this is this amazing work that's been happening, I'd say, for probably 2 decades, or getting close to 2 decades now, by different Indigenous legal scholars. And so when we look at these, one of the questions that we have is, how do we work with some of these resources given the impacts of colonialism? Right, some of these resources require deep cultural knowledge, which not all Indigenous peoples themselves necessarily have access to. We were talking about in earlier presentations, but these days many Indigenous people do not go out on the land as much, perhaps are not involved in many ceremonies, and I'm going to talk more about language, but many Indigenous peoples do not know how to speak their Indigenous languages because of colonialism. And so this potentially creates a real challenge for doing Indigenous law revitalization. How do we access that? And yes, the best answer would be, we'll go to the elders and we'll talk to the knowledge holders and they'll tell us all of that. They may not have all of that, but also there's a limited supply as well of knowledge holders and elders. And so we've also in this work need to think about ways to not just rely on those sources, but to work with these other resources. So this is some of this work happening in Indigenous law revitalization. The thing is, there are other resources that don't necessarily require such deep immersed cultural knowledge, like published stories, dictionaries. These are the things that I'm going to be talking about. So but one problem with these sources is that they might be more accessible, such as stories that were passed down, written down by missionary priests or explorers, or dictionaries that were written down by the same sort of actors that have been passed down. So there's still some amazing cultural knowledge available in there. So there's also these publicly available resources. So some of the work that some people are doing in Indigenous law is trying to work with these other more accessible resources. The challenge is that they can be perhaps not as reliable as the deeply immersed, bringing in the knowledge holder, bringing in the elder. And so it creates its own challenge. Things that were passed down to Europeans may have been recorded in ways that include bias. And so what's necessary when you're trying to work with these resources is, in fact, working in ways that you can have discussions, debates about, well, is that really part of, for example, Mi'kmaq values and principles, or was that imparted by the person who recorded the story or recorded the language? And so, what we get in the last decade or so are various scholars who have been working. It's coming, right? I see it coming. Various scholars who have been, there we go, have been working on, and it's great, I just transitioned to the next slide, perfect. So several Indigenous scholars have been working on developing methodologies to work with these resources. So you see some of their names up there, and there's, this is pretty, new, but there's a few that have really been taken hold in the last few years. And so, we have Indigenous scholars who are writing their PhDs and then writing various articles on this, but you see that there are various different methodologies that are being developed. So community embedded methodologies, studying community practices, land-based learning, looking at how practices based on the land, we can look at that to understand values, principles. I have a colleague, she does quill work with porcupine quills. I don't know if you've seen this before, but Mi'kmaq, we collect porcupine quills, and she actually weaves it into birch bark and does phenomenal art. But there's also Mi'kmaq teachings in not only the artwork itself, but the whole process from the collecting of the quills to the taking of the birch bark from the birch tree that are embedded with cultural teachings. And so she is writing about that. Darcy Lindbergh has a wonderful short paper that's so wonderful that talks about the sweat lodge ceremony and how cultural teachings, knowledge, values are all embedded into every part of that ceremony. I'm going to focus on, and this has been the focus of my academic work in the last few years, is the narrative method, which was developed primarily by Val Napoleon and Hadley Friedland. And I am working with that, but also embedding into it my work with the language, because it's kind of all about weaving these different things together to provide a more comprehensive, fuller picture about the way our people thought, and then the values that are embedded in that and the principles that are embedded in that. And yeah, there's a bunch of other methodologies and some really great work that is happening. So that is your introduction to the Indigenous law revitalization piece. And now I'm going to move us into talking about the work that I have been doing with language. So from the teachings that my sister had given me, which she got from my father and various community members and our grandparents, it struck me when starting to do this work that there was a little bit of writing about the ways that one could use Indigenous languages to draw out values, laws, values, principles, rules. But I've tried to identify even more ways based on some of the teachings that I was getting. So, I have heard a lot of people say that, when it comes to, that there is this, really intrinsic link between language and culture. We were talking about that in the earlier session, but also language and law. So you see some of these quotes on the screen, that language is the custodian of our worldview. It has a role in maintaining our constitutional and legal orders. And so I have a paper that this is basically what I'm presenting for the rest of the talk. And I have 6 more of these over there on that chair because I don't know why, but McGill Law gave me 8 copies. I already gave one away. But yeah, so if any of you are interested in actually having a physical copy of the paper, I put them over there on that because I don't know what else to do with them. So you may have them if you are so interested. So I'm going to talk about the 5 methodologies I identified in the paper. So I'm going to unpack each of these in turn. But first, what I do in the paper is use the Mi'kmaq language to illustrate these 5 concepts, or these 5 methods. But I do think that they could equally be applied to other Indigenous languages in Canada and beyond. So a few things about Mi'kmaq. It's part of the Algonquin language family, which is a large language family that includes Cree-Anishinaabeg and various other languages. So we have a writing system initially written down by a missionary priest, and over time, standardized a bit more, although there's, and my dad always said writing systems are political. So currently we have 4 writing systems. He also created a writing system, and it's my favorite, not only because it's my dad's, but because it's the best. It's a phonetic Indigenous writing system, and I'm happy to talk more about it, but a couple of the other systems are based on sort of downsized systems where some letters play double duty. So a D and a T will be written just to be a T, and you kind of have to know certain phonetic rules in order to pronounce it. And for people learning Mi'kmaq as a second language, it can be really daunting. And there's so I prefer a fully representational system, which is what my dad had developed. We can come back to writing systems if you are so inclined later. But yeah, there are 4 that operate in Mi'kmaq. There are also sort of generally 2 dialects of Mi'kmaq, a southern and a northern dialect, but even within communities, there are different, differences of the way people say things in the Mi'kmaq community. There's always a couple of ways to say something, and you just kind of have to roll with it. In terms of me earlier talking about working with published resources, this is a way that I think makes working with Indigenous languages more accessible, so that you don't have to be a fully fluent speaker in order to engage with these methods. Some of them do require you to perhaps dive into some work that's happening on grammar. Some of it might be less complicated than that even, but it is possible to do this work, but even if you are just learning. And so that was a big message in my paper that, I'm not fully fluent yet. I've learned a lot over the last few years, and that other folks can do this too. You don't have to feel that you have to be have all this knowledge or be a complete fluent speaker to do this. Also, interestingly, and it's a sort of untapped area, but we have Mi'kmaq actually had a hieroglyphic system or ideograph system. It's debated about how extensively it was used, but early on, missionary priests would use, and so the examples you see of this, would use this ideograph system in order to put down the prayers, and so to try to Christianize Mi'kmaq. So there is books. There's actually a dictionary that was compiled by a linguist from York back in 1999 that actually has the hieroglyphic system in it. But there are not many people who actually understand it very well today, or use it to write. In Mi'kmaq, it's called Ogomkweju Wigahan, which means suckerfish system, or suckerfish writing, because it looks like the sort of symbols that a suckerfish leaves on to sort of filter the sand. So that's a little bit of a explanation of Mi'kmaq. I mean, I'm sure you're all very familiar with, this whole conference we've been talking about language loss, particularly minority languages and language loss. Certainly those statistics, I didn't have a slide on that, but they're significant in terms of Indigenous languages. But there's been, in the last couple of censuses, some promising developments in terms of acquisition as second language speakers. And so we see that that is now happening in many, in Mi'kmaq communities, I know, and mine is one of them, where you have more and more people acquiring Mi'kmaq as a second language. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the different five linguistic methods that I wanted to talk about. And I also have not been timing this, so you'll have to, you might want to my timer, you'll just want to be, I'm recognizing now that I did not press the button properly, so it's not been keeping time, so you need to now keep me accountable. I think I have about a half an hour, right? Yeah, perfect. Get those, perfect. Okay, so five methods. So the one that's probably the most popular, or the one that is used the most right now, is what I call the meta principle method. It's a reference to some writing by HLA Hart, but there was a judge, an Anishinaabe judge from the US, who referenced HLA's Hart's theory about primary and secondary types of law. I'm not going to get into that. You can read the paper to get into that. But the basic idea is that there are some concepts in Indigenous languages that actually hold a whole variety of principles or concepts within them. If you've been around Indigenous peoples, you might hear in the English version of it, all my relations, right? Various Indigenous people have a kind of an expression for that. In Mi'kmaq, it's Umsit and it means all my cousins, all my relations. And you know, that talks about relationality, respect for each other. So there's concepts embedded in that, and there are other concepts, far more than that. And so some of the work that's happening here, or I guess another way to think about it, there's a Métis elder who has talked about it as each word being a bundle. And that, you know, you can draw out more concepts or principles from that. One that we talk a lot about, at least in sort of the more southern part of Mi'kmaq, is Naiomi, which means sort of stewardship of the land. It expresses our relationship with other beings in creation, and a lot of communities are now working with that. In fact, the Nova Scotia government put the word Naiomi in their 2019 Sustainability Act as a principle that has to be followed in carrying out the act. There are many other examples like that. So I have another paper that actually just looks at about 6 different examples of uses of meta principles in this way. And they can be from provincial governments, territorial governments. This happens significantly in Nunavut with IQ. I cannot pronounce it very well, but it's essentially this idea of Inuit traditional knowledge. If you were in the session earlier, we had a speaker that laid them out, some of the principles out in a very enlightening way. But there are many examples in Nunavut, various statutes that include references to IQ principles that have to be used to interpret the law. There's a case, so the American judge, Matthew Fletcher, who sort of first coined this concept of the meta principle, talks about a case where a tribal judge was interpreting about whether somebody had a right to counsel or to be informed of a right to counsel, because the tribal law did not specifically specify anything approximating what in the US is called your Miranda rights, right? Your right to counsel and right to be told and all of that. And so the debate was whether that existed within the legal order, and there wasn't anything specific. But the judge drew from this concept, hazo eogo, which talks about respect and relationality. And he gets into more about what it means. But from that, he drew out that there would equally be, it would include a right of an individual to be told about why they were being apprehended and their rights as a suspect in custody. So That's another example. My own community has developed a lobster law. If you know about East Coast fisheries issues involving Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey, but we have our own lobster law. Within the lobster law itself, there are 4 key principles that are set out and explained and used to, and they're required. Anyone applying the law has to use those, interpret those principles to interpret the law. So that is one example of meta principles, or many examples, I should say, of the meta principle method. And you can read more about that in the paper. But it is by far the method that is used the most by Indigenous communities so far in law revitalization. What's kind of neat about it, one of the practices one of my colleagues does, is when she's doing workshops, she might ask a group of elders, for example, or the group that is collected, what does, now we'll take the word Nadugalimp, but what does Nadugalimp mean when it is followed? What does Nadugalimp mean when it is not followed? And so what is a historical example when Nadugalimp was followed? So through that, there's a conversation that is generated where the community is identifying various ways that they think this principle has or has not been respected, which informs what that principle means. So some neat work happening there. All right. Talk about a few other methods. These are sort of, I would say, emergent, but there's a lot that could be understood through working with this. So this is a picture of my dad's dictionary that was referred to earlier. Yeah, I'm going to speak about a few things, but there's a lot that can be learned by examining the grammar of Indigenous languages. And when my sister was teaching me and my dad taught her, there was big emphasis put on the grammar of our language. So it in itself can reveal a number of important values, which we can then use we can draw on to inform our laws. So a few examples that I'll just give you about Mi'kmaq and many other Indigenous languages are similar, is that we have highly verb-based languages. And people have commented on this, so I cite several authors who have talked about what does the fact that we have a very verb-based language say about how we see the world, right? So a lot of this is about telling us about the worldview, which then kind of we can draw values and principles from. So Duma Young talks about how the verb-based nature of our language shows that we are a people who are very experiential, that we are very action-oriented in seeing the world, as another author writes, as always being in flux and change, and even sometimes being kind of accustomed to chaos, because we kind of see the world as always changing. And that same source talks about how this idea of change and flux that is, you can see even embedded in our language, is supported in other places as well, such as stories, but they support values such as renewal, rehabilitation, and redemption. The fact that things will always change, people can change from good to bad, and that, there's no person who is fully evil, and that people can always sort of turn things around. So, yeah, the verb-based nature of our language is one example, and there's so many more. My other example here is just that in Mi'kmaq, our primary grammatical category is animacy and inanimacy. Whether something is alive or not alive is the primary way we conjugate our verbs. And so, some of so we have a large category of things that fall into the animate category, including plants, rocks, mountains, thunder, many geographical features. And people have pointed to that as well as other things, but pointed to this in particular to say that, this idea of Umsit Nogama, that we have a relationship with so many other things, not just humans, but with the physical world around us, and how it is also, we see it as living, and that we have relationships with it, is supported in our language as well. And there's so much more. There's how we use pronouns, which are different than in English. Possessives is a really other interesting one. All of this can be kind of mined for how we see the world, right? But in Mi'kmaq, kinship terms are, they always have a pronominal marker, right? So there is no sort of standalone word for father or mother. It's my father, your father, their father. And so that is built into the word. And so it's always sort of showing the relationship between Indigenous people, between a family. And there's so much more. And so I just give some examples of it. And I haven't mined all these to sort of, discover what each of them means. I identify the promise, I guess, of looking at these various grammatical features. Another grammatical feature of our language that I wanted to quickly talk about is just the fact that we have a polysynthetic language system. And many Indigenous languages are polysynthetic. That is, it means that our language sort of works like Lego blocks. There are smaller units called word formatives or word parts, and they come together to form certain words, and there's rules around how you can form them. But it makes a very descriptive language. It also makes for a language that can be living, right? That you can continue to use these word formatives to create new words and not necessarily borrow from English. And there is a word part dictionary in Mi'kmaq, and I'm assuming perhaps other dictionaries as well, but there's a lot. One thing I love about being learning is that sometimes I don't know the full word, but I know some of the word parts, and I can get a gist of what is being conveyed. But the word parts themselves, I think, can be a rich source of explaining Mi'kmaq values and how we see what these word formatives mean. So just to give a kind of interesting example, one that I was fascinated with when my sister was teaching me about something called the absentive case in Mi'kmaq. And so there's this morpheme, ach or ok, which is used to denote that a physical body may be there, but someone is no longer present. So for example, if you were to say someone was alive, so if I was my father's Manny is Nucha Diluizit Manny, and my father's name is Manny. My father is deceased, and so to say that properly, you would say Nucha Diluizit Benach Manny. Or another way to say it is somebody said when now Manny Oak. Oak means that it's another marker to suggest that a person is deceased or no longer with us. So those two sort of markers are really interesting, in particular the oak. The oak is also used in Mi'kmaq to make things a container. So if you take the word sisamahon, which is the word for sugar, and you put oak at the end of it, it means sugar bowl. And if you take the word flour and put oak, it's a flower pot. So my dad theorized, and my sister passed this on, but my dad has done a lot of writing about Mi'kmaq spirituality. But and there's lots in our culture and stories that speak to Mi'kmaq beliefs in reincarnation and such. But even this idea of putting oak as a container, and how oak is also used to denote that someone has passed away, sort of suggests that we see the soul perhaps as separate from one's physical container while an earthly being. So that is more perhaps a spiritual example, but John Burroughs tells us that the sacred can also be a source of Indigenous law as well. Another method that I talk about in the paper is word clusters or groups. And this can be done by, there are many dictionaries that are available. And I've been doing a lot of this work of, searching through these dictionaries. Some of them are online and they're very easy to search. But finding collections or groupings or clusters of words and studying them in order to learn how they work. So there's just an infinite amount of clusters, right? So a couple of examples some of the writers talk about is our words for color. That some of our words for color are associative of the environment. So our word for green means green like a fir tree. Our word for sky means blue like the sky. And so these authors talk about how, even describing colors really talks about our relationship with nature. Similarly, our words for months each speak to, how activities that happen during that period or specific expectations that are expected of what one does during that specific month. And then there's all kinds of other clusters you can do. There's a colleague who looked at different Mi'kmaq concepts that have to do with justice, and then compared them to a number of English concepts for justice, and compared them, and they were interesting in what they were how they were similar, and also how they differed. That there were in some cases, a complete absence from one column or the other, which spoke to a different way of seeing Mi'kmaq justice issues. I've also been doing clusters with stories. And I'll speak more to that. Back to this concept of Nadugalim that I spoke about before, which is about Mi'kmaq stewardship concepts. I was really interested about looking up different words for sharing in different Mi'kmaq dictionaries. And I found over 20 different words for sharing. And I just thought that was interesting. And they all describe very kind of little nuances on the concept. But for example, there's a word for when somebody has more than their share. And then when someone shares their wealth with others, when someone deprives someone else of their shares. And there's a word for how something is shared equally among a group. And probably most interestingly, the word for chief or leader, sahamau, in Mi'kmaq literally means the one who makes certain that everyone receives his or her fair share of community goods, regardless of standing, age, or gender. So I just find that extremely interesting, and I think tells us a lot about the Mi'kmaq worldview, the values around sharing. Last slide, and I know I've got a little bit of time left. Another area of where, and this one is sort of the marriage between linguistics, but also place, and that's place names. And Indigenous peoples generally have very different sort of naming practices, maybe a little overlap, but for the most part, quite different, quite descriptive naming practices for their places. And the authorities that I looked at sort of identified about 7. So it can be, a naming practice can include identifying the physical characteristics of the territory. It could talk about the different resources that are available. It could talk about portage routes. Could relate a story about a mythical being. There are many places that talk about Glooskap or are named after Glooskap, for example. There could be place names that are comparative, and also some that have stories associated with them. John Burroughs talks about how, sometimes with respect to natural law or land-based law, that the law can be written on the land. And place names are essentially that. It is how Indigenous peoples describe their place. And so I think that there's a lot of richness in these names that can be used, again, to draw out values, principles, and rules with respect to places. Yeah, and so I think I've just given you a brief overview of my 5 methods, but the work that I've been doing with these of late have been trying to sort of pair them with other methodologies, particularly what's called the story method. I don't have too much time. I'm not going to get into this whole slide, but Friedland and Napoleon have a whole methodology that they've developed about working with Indigenous stories. And you analyze them. They call it the case briefing method, but it's a way to analyze a story in order to pull out its teachings. And its teachings are values, principles, and rules. And then arranging them in a framework. So you can take 10 stories, you can take 40 stories, and see them as being about legal themes, and then analyzing them based on that. And there's a lot of work that's being done on this, and Friedland and Napoleon have several articles that you can find. This is what the case briefing sort of question looks like. What are the facts? How was the matter resolved? What are the teachings or the reasons that one can draw out of it? And also bracketing some questions that you might have if you're not familiar with a particular concept in the story. But then you arrange what you pull from the stories into an analytical framework. There are different ones that we've developed, but here's one that we did. We read a variety of Glooskap stories and asked the question, what does the story teach us about positive qualities of leadership, negative qualities, legal processes that leaders take in decision-making and deciding? What does it tell us about the legal obligations of leaders to their people, of people to their leaders, and vice versa? So that's a little example of some of the neat work that we're doing. If I had more time, I think I'll probably give a bit of time for stories, but I would show you a brief story that looks at that unpacks it. But I don't have time, but what I do want to show you is just a little bit. I'm going to bring this all here. I won't show you the story. I'll tell you the story. It takes about 30 seconds. It's a story about Glooskap, who is walking in the woods in the fall. He sees children who appear sad, and they don't have any toys. That's remarked upon. So Glooskap calls them over, and he puts seeds in their hands, and he says, put out your hands and be respectful and don't make any sudden movements. And then these chickadees come and they eat from their hand and they make the children happy. And it's a very brief story. That's essentially it. The children were taught how to respect the birds and also how to play with the birds and enjoy the birds and be in relationship with the birds. That's basically it. And it's, there's much more. So there's some stories that are much longer and complex, but even from something like that, you can do a case briefing of these stories. And so, for example, this is one we did in a group session. Yes, so some of the teachings that we drew out, for example, that animals are not property, you have to learn how to respect them. That Glooskap as a leader understood it's important for children to be happy and that he should use his power or authority to make them happy, that children also have a role to play in their own development and addressing if they're bored. And that children must be taught how to treat the chickadees with respect and such. Anyway, another thing that we pull from this, if we do several stories, this is an example of a framework, the earlier framework that I showed you, where we didn't just take that one particular story, but a number, but chickadees is in here, but drawing out from all of them the different teachings. So for example, one of them under the positive qualities of leadership is concern and compassion when children or people are sad or excluded, comes from chickadee. Then there's another one, being proactive as a leader. Glooskap was proactive in managing the children's well-being. So you see this just as a little taste. I do longer workshops, but something that I've done with this is to combine it with the work that I've been doing on language. And taking from the stories the most, the words, the key nouns, the key verbs that are revealed. So I have some of the words that appear in my dad's dictionary for Glooskap, but something that's really interesting that even adds to the discussion, for example, I'll go to is the verbs in Mi'kmaq for teach. So in that story, we saw Glooskap teach the children, and in Mi'kmaq, there's 4 different words. So there's Begagnamat, which means you teach someone about something in a very thorough and disciplined way. Geginamat, which just means you're teaching someone. Nestalwat, which means you teach someone the value of responsibility. And Milkihinuramat, which means you teach someone in a serious way, or you indoctrinate them with your morals and ethics. And we've been doing that with these different Glooskap stories. So we've been not only analyzing them using the story briefing method, but pulling out the language. And what I've loved about this too is that in some of my workshops, many people are not full fluent speakers, but in this way they get to engage with the Mi'kmaq language as well as with stories that they feel that they're getting more out of it and we can see more. And so in a conversation just about the story, we can talk about what version of verb of teaching was Glooskap doing in the story, and what does this tell us about the role of teaching that leaders do. So that is just a little bit of a taste of work that I'm doing. I think my last slide is to tell you that we've got some grant funding and we're working with different Mi'kmaq organizations in Nova Scotia. We're calling it the Glooskap Project, and we're taking this broader and we are going to try to develop over about a series of meetings with a collection of folks who will come together. We're going to, in advance, identify Glooskap stories on various legal issues and bring folks together, the same group of Mi'kmaq folks, to discuss at each turn, create these frameworks. We're also developing a database in Zotero, which we're currently have about 70 stories, but we're summarizing the stories, we're identifying them by legal topic, and so that it can be something that is used for this project, but then also in the future. So that is a very brief introduction of some of the work that I've been up to with language and revitalization of Indigenous legal orders. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. It was an excellent talk.